It's remarkable that in California, it's against the law to pick a poppy because the poppy is a protected flower in California. It's our state flower. But it's not illegal to cut down a 1,000-year-old redwood tree. And that just seems way out of whack to me.
That's a good point.
I like it. Old-growth trees, particularly redwood trees, are kind of one of our cultural symbols here. I think when people think of Northern California, one of the great natural treasures they think of is old-growth forests.
Such an emblem of our state, and we think of these parks and where you can drive through the old-growth tree and all that stuff. So people do think that, that our forests are protected, and the reality is that they're not. And old-growth trees, old-growth redwoods are being cut down in California every day.
Ancient forests, big trees, are more important in the environment than smaller or even-age managed trees on, say, tree plantations. Sequestration of atmospheric carbon. We all know about global warming. It's the big trees, the ancient trees, that lock up more pounds of carbon in their tissues than the small tree farms or any other small trees you want to point to. In fact, studies have shown that about 3 times the volume of carbon is sequestered or locked up in ancient forests than is locked up in other kinds of forests. So it's an enormous volume difference, and the Pacific Northwest and California's ancient redwoods, say, that forest ecosystem type holds more carbon than any other kind of forest in the world, including the rainforests in the Amazon. The reason for that is that so much of the biomass of the forest, the living tissue, is actually alive and in production above ground, where it can be stored as carbon.
And so the lumber from such trees gives us a wood that has the same enduring qualities. Also the wood that has a beauty which we enjoy in our homes for its richness and warmth of color. For just as the Russians discovered at the time when their old empire extended into California, and they built this stockade and blockhouse at Fort Ross, redwood has not only beauty and endurance, but a strength born out of the ages. The world's biggest and oldest of living things, the Coast and Nevada redwoods, continue to live in our use of them just as they continue to live and grow in our forests today.
Generally used, and I think generally accepted now, is that 3% of the original native forest of California is still standing. It's my understanding that about 80,000 acres of old growth is currently protected in California, and most of that is in state parks, national parks. A good deal of it is here in Mendocino County or up in Humboldt County. Those, it's laudable that the state has purchased and set aside some of these forests. We would argue that it's not enough, but even more important perhaps for wildlife and for species that depend on old-growth forests for their very lives. Many of these properties are fragmented and provide no corridor for wildlife to travel from one part of the forest to another. So we think it's important that wherever possible that we protect ancient trees, and even if they're single or in small groups, so that the genetic characteristics and the ecological characteristics of old growth be regenerated. So we think it's important that we preserve these trees wherever they still are. And in many cases, the reason these trees still exist is because they've been very difficult for the loggers to get to. But with modern logging techniques, there almost isn't a tree left that they can't get to. A lot of logging is being done now with helicopters. And as we know, a helicopter can, it doesn't matter how steep a slope is or how difficult the terrain is, if they can get a choker on it and attach that cable to a helicopter, they can lift that tree out of there. So it's almost like the trees hardly stand a chance anymore with the kind of technology that we being humankind, can now bring to bear against the forest. It's almost like an unfair fight. But it's not only unfair for the trees, but it's unfair for all the species that depend on old growth trees, old growth forest, old growth characteristics, all the kind of flora and fauna that many of us never even give a thought to depends on those trees and those forests in order to live. So we're not only struggling on behalf of the trees, but also on behalf of all the living forms that the trees support.
Why ancient trees or old growth trees are different than other trees. There are a lot of other reasons. Structural differences. There are more dead tops, snags, and downed logs in streams and on the forest floor. Those add all kinds of interesting structures and habitats for a wide array of animals and plants that can't get a foothold in smaller forests. Animals that need nesting cavities and burrows. Animals that need the fungus that lives in the fine root filaments in ancient trees. Those fungal patterns in ancient forest soil are unique to ancient forests. They're not really found in newer forests unless they're artificially inoculated with that fungus.